So this is our last lecture for the chapter 24, fluid balance. Remember we talked about the three types of homeostatic balance, which we've talked about in our previous lectures. So this is fluid balance, electrolyte balance, and now we're going to be talking about acid-base balance. Okay? So acid-base balance is one of the most important aspects of homeostasis. And this is because metabolism depends greatly on enzymes, and enzymes are pretty sensitive to pH. So remember, one such enzyme like that would be pepsin, which is within the stomach. You should know from our previous lectures that pepsin acts to digest peptides or proteins and is inactivated when it reaches the small intestine because of the change in pH, so that it's only active when it's in the high pH of the stomach. So slight deviations from that normal pH could shut down entire metabolic pathways because these enzymes might become denatured. And this is because slight deviation from normal pHs can actually alter the structure and function of macromolecules, which are just large molecules like enzymes. So the pH of a solution is determined solely by the hydrogen ions. So the formal definition of an acid is any chemical that releases hydrogen ions in solution. And bases are any chemical that accept hydrogen in solution. So the normal pH, remember that 7 is neutral. The normal pH range of blood and tissue fluid is a little bit different from a little bit above neutral. So it's at about 7.35 to 7.45. And I know this sounds slight because it's only 0.10 of a range and it's pretty narrow, but the body really needs to stay within that small window. So challenges to maintaining acid-base balance throughout the body is that the metabolism constantly is producing acid. So we talked about lactic acid before. From anaerobic fermentation, this could build up in the cells. And then there's also phosphoric acid from nucleic acid catabolism, fatty acids and ketones from fat catabolism. You might have heard of ketones when like the Atkins diet or the ketogenic diet were in style. So you would want to be in ketosis, which is where you're creating ketones. And then there's also carbonic acid from carbon dioxide. So I don't expect you to remember these exact acids, but do remember that metabolism is constantly producing acid, and this is something that the body has to fight. So a buffer is any mechanism that resists changes in pH. So there can be physiological buffers, which are a system that controls output of acids, bases, or carbon dioxide. So of the physiological buffers, some of the greatest ones are the urinary system, which buffers the greatest quantity of acids or base, and this takes several hours to days to exert its effects. Whereas the respiratory system buffers a little bit less, but can buffer it within minutes. And it can't alter the pH as much as the urinary system, but it does quicker. So definitely know what these forms of physiological buffers are and their examples, and know how respiratory system versus urinary system buffering, what are the pros and cons of each. A chemical buffer is a substance that binds hydrogen and removes it from solution as the concentration begins to rise, or it can release hydrogen into solution as the concentration falls. So it tries to keep pH stable. So this is able to restore normal pH in fractions of a second. The main chemical buffers within the body are bicarbonate, phosphate, as well as protein. So the bicarbonate buffer system is the basis for the strong buffering capacity of the respiratory system. So having CO2 in body fluids will raise the hydrogen concentration and therefore lower the pH. When you remove carbon dioxide, you have the opposite effect. So removing carbon dioxide will actually increase the pH. So bicarbonate buffer system is able to neutralize 2 or 3 times as much acid as chemical buffers are able to. Oops. Goodness, okay. So carbon dioxide is constantly being produced by aerobic metabolism. So this is just normal metabolism. And usually this is eliminated by the lungs at an equivalent rate that it's created. So you get carbon dioxide from metabolism that lowers pH by releasing hydrogen, but also carbon dioxide can raise pH by binding hydrogen. This is why it's a buffer. I don't expect you to know these equations, but I do want you to know that carbon dioxide can both lower and raise pH. So increased carbon dioxide and a decreased pH will stimulate pulmonary ventilation, which will cause you to breathe at an increased rate, while an increased pH will inhibit pulmonary ventilation, so it'll decrease pulmonary ventilation rate. Make sure you understand how pH alters ventilation rate and how carbon dioxide plays a role in this. So acidosis is when the pH of extracellular fluid falls below the normal value of 7.35, and this occurs when hydrogen diffuses into cells and drives out potassium, which then elevates potassium concentration in extracellular fluid. Remember that potassium is higher intracellularly than extracellularly, and this could be kind of a problem if you have that change in concentration in extracellular fluid. Look at the last lecture to see what some of the complications of changing potassium balance could be. So hydrogen is buffered by proteins in the intracellular fluid, so the net result is a cation loss. And this could cause membrane hyperpolarization, nerve and muscle, meaning that nerve and muscle cells will be hard to stimulate. And it can also cause central nervous system depression, which could lead to confusion, disorientation, coma, and possibly death. So this is not a good thing. Alkalosis occurs when the pH is above that normal value of 7.45. And this occurs when hydrogen diffuses out of cells and potassium diffuses in. Membranes then become depolarized, nerves can become overstimulated, and muscles can cause spasm, tetany, convulsions, and eventually respiratory paralysis, which then could lead to death. So because of this, these are pretty extreme complications. A person can't live for more than a few hours if blood pH is at these extremes. So if it's below 7 or above 7.7. So these are really bad. So acid-base imbalances fall into 2 different categories. You can have respiratory and metabolic imbalances. Respiratory acidosis occurs when the rate of alveolar ventilation fails to keep pace with the body's rate of CO2 production. So this means that carbon dioxide is going to accumulate in extracellular fluid and then lower the pH of the extracellular fluid. This is common in emphysema, where there's a severe reduction of functional alveoli so that they can't ventilate or get rid of the CO2 as fast as it's accumulating. Respiratory alkalosis can result from hyperventilation, and this means that CO2 can be eliminated faster than it's produced. Remember when we talked about this with the respiratory lecture, and this is when people would breathe into a bag to try to rebreathe in that carbon dioxide to go back to normal. Metabolic acidosis results from an increased production of organic acids like lactic acid or ketones in alcoholism or even in diabetes. And the ingestion of acidic drugs like aspirin can also lead to metabolic acidosis. It could also be because of losing bases due to chronic diarrhea or laxative overuse. And there's also metabolic alkalosis, which is rare but can result from overuse of bicarbonates such as antacids and IV bicarbonate solutions. Or it could be from the loss of stomach acid, like with chronic vomiting. Much like circulatory shock, we can have compensated or uncompensated acidosis or alkalosis. So in compensated acidosis or alkalosis, the kidneys will compensate for imbalances of respiratory origin, or the respiratory system will compensate for metabolic pH imbalances. So this means that they're helping one another out. In uncompensated acidosis or alkalosis, the pH balance, but the pH balance within the body imbalance can't be corrected without a clinical intervention. So the body's not able to correct it itself. So respiratory compensation is when changes in pulmonary ventilation will correct changes in the pH of body fluids by either expelling or retaining CO2. So if there's hypercapnia, which means excess CO2, then there will be increased pulmonary ventilation, which will cause elimination of carbon dioxide and will allow pH within the blood to rise. With hypocapnia, where there's a deficiency of CO2, ventilation is reduced so that CO2 can accumulate within the body and then lower pH. So we'll stop there and we'll talk a little bit about the urinary system, but we'll finish the rest during our next meeting.